Few historical populations are more recognizable than the Vikings, and one thing that makes them distinctive is their approach to war and combat. These Scandinavian raiders had their own unique culture and style of fighting that has become legendary in the annals of history. Today we're going to learn what it took to fight like a Viking. Welcome to the Viking Vault. Background. Everyone is familiar with the term, but when we say Vikings, who are we talking about really? The term Vikings refers to the warriors of Scandinavian society, that is Denmark, Sweden and Norway, from the 8th until the 11th century. They were profoundly exploratory, venturing by sea into distant lands such as the Mediterranean, the Middle East and North Africa. Believe it or not, some of them even made it all the way to certain parts of North America, becoming the first ever Europeans to ever do so, although nobody really knew about this until centuries later. To commandeer such a vast expanse of diverse land, the Vikings had to have a rock-solid credo when it came to the art of war. In fact, the Vikings developed an entirely new approach to battle that made them almost unstoppable. Whether you were a farmer living in England or a Muslim praying in the temples of the Iberian Peninsula, the arrival of Viking ships meant your worst nightmares were coming true. Viking attacks usually came without warning and would swiftly decimate whole villages in hours. By the time any survivors had a chance to sift through the smouldering rubble, the Viking fleet would already be gone. Try as they might to protect themselves against Viking raids, and believe me, they definitely tried, few societies at the time were equipped to withstand these deadly sneak attacks. One of the biggest reasons why was that Viking warriors had been trained in a martial arts system that no one else had ever heard of: Glima. Glima. When you were born in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, one of the first steps to becoming a Viking would have been practicing Glima. In the language of Old Norse, the term Glima means glimpse or flash. Today, it is often seen as a somewhat eccentric style of Nordic folk wrestling, but in the age of the Vikings, it was a very rigorous practice used to train lightning-fast reflexes and fluid agility. Despite the stereotypical horned helmet-wearing way they are often depicted, the real Vikings were actually quite nimble on their feet in addition to being physically strong. Glima involves hand-to-hand combat like many martial arts, but it is much more grappling heavy and tends to focus on dragging or swinging your opponent rather than striking them with blows. The goal is to leverage your position and use your body weight to compel your opponent to lose their footing. Training in this unusual style made Vikings difficult for outsiders to contend with when they met them face to face. It also trained Viking warriors to have incredible strength and stability, which is now the stuff of legend. Weapons. Skilled though they were in hand-to-hand combat, fighting like a Viking involved much more than just training in martial arts. When they boarded their ships and sailed off for battle, they brought plenty of weapons too. Before they even set foot on the shore, Vikings on a raid would pull out their longbows. These bows were big, some of them more than 6 feet from end to end. The bows were typically made from the wood of yew trees. Pulling back the string, probably made from hemp, silk or linen, required significant strength. Pull it far enough, however, and the iron-tipped arrow could fly as far as 300 meters, nearly 1,000 feet. This could take out large numbers of a defending army whilst they were still squinting to even recognize the Vikings on the horizon. But the airborne ambush would only be getting started. Next came the spears. The Vikings had more spears than any other weapon. They required relatively little metal and were cheap to make. The Vikings also favored spears because they were lethally good at throwing them. For starters, they were ambidextrous, throwing equally well with either the left or the right hand. They also had considerable strength and coordination thanks to their training, which made their throwing range nearly 100 feet. You were likely to be impaled by arrows, spears, or both well before you ever even got a good look at a Viking. But if you saw one up close, well, that's when the real weaponry started to come out. For close combat, the Vikings would carry shields in one hand and a weapon of choice in the other. The shields were typically made out of wood with a small iron dome at the center to protect their hand. On the other hand, they would typically wield a battle axe or perhaps a lance or a sword. Battle armor. Of course, Viking warriors had to shoot arrows, throw spears, and juggle shields and axes, all while wearing an array of protective clothing. Viking armor, as it were, is another way that fighting like a Viking was a unique task. In Scandinavia, both then and today, keeping warm was essential. To insulate against the elements, all Vikings wore multiple layers of thick garb, usually made from wool. The dress code was similar when going into battle. Vikings often wore thick tunics or cloaks made from sheepskin, as well as a layer of leather body armor. Weapons would also be stashed on the Vikings' waist in a leather belt to enable switching from axe to lance and so forth. It is a common misconception that Vikings wore helmets with horns in them. However, it is true that they did sometimes wear metal helmets. These helmets were in fact similar to other helmets seen throughout medieval Europe. They were forged out of iron and expensive to make, therefore not all Vikings wore them. It would seem as though the helmet wearers were the lucky ones, that is until you find out that these helmets could weigh as much as 5 pounds. Shooting arrows hundreds of yards, throwing spears with both hands, switching between lances and axes whilst protecting yourself with a wooden shield, all while wearing thick warm layers and a 5-pound helmet. Fighting like a Viking can start to sound like an impossible task. But believe it or not, there were even more elite skills necessary to successfully fight like a Viking. Warships. Another major element of Viking warfare was the unique method of transportation that enabled such dynamic raids in the first place. Viking ships were unlike any other ships of their day, and sailing them required both skill and precision. Whereas many other European warships were huge and designed to be physically imposing, Viking ships were extremely light, narrow, and fast. In favourable conditions, they could reach a speed of almost 20 miles an hour. Plus, unlike other European warships, they could sail in extremely shallow water, enabling the Vikings to traverse winding rivers and attack from unexpected places. To even reach the battlefield, Viking warriors had to spend weeks or even months crammed together on a narrow vessel with no roof. The weather was almost always brutal. When they weren't rowing, they were trying to eat or trying to sleep while directly exposed to the elements. In addition to the technical skills required to drive these high-speed boats through rivers and across vast oceans, the Vikings also had to have a steely resolve. Their ships were almost entirely designed around efficiency rather than comfort, and they were more uncomfortable than most of us will ever be in our entire lives. Believe like a Viking. Which brings us to yet another crucial ingredient. To truly fight like a Viking, you had to be a Viking, not just on the outside, but in your heart and mind as well. Christianity was spreading all throughout Europe during the Viking Age, but in Scandinavia, the Vikings stood out for remaining steadfast in their traditional Old Norse beliefs. The Vikings were pantheists, believing in many gods rather than one. Some of these gods will be familiar to all of us, albeit in their Marvel Cinematic Universe renditions. Thor, Loki, and Odin are just some of the many gods who are said to influence daily life for the Vikings. Everything from whether they had a good breakfast to whether they lived or died on the battlefield. To fight like a Viking meant that you believed the gods were on your side, and that if you died in battle, you would join the gods in Asgard. You would feast and fight eternally in the Hall of the Slain, a place within Asgard called Valhalla. Or, if so chosen, you would instead follow the goddess Freya to a meadow called Folkvangr. Underlying the Vikings' whole approach to warfare was their unwavering belief in their gods and the divine destiny they were fulfilling. From Njord, the god of the sea and winds, powering their warships, to Odin lending his strength as they held their spears, Viking warriors fought with supernatural confidence. Their confidence was only further bolstered by their frequent victories. Viking culture. Indeed, the Vikings did win an extraordinary amount of battles and struck terror into a huge stretch of the globe. Where did this insatiable ambition come from in the first place? Why were the Vikings so driven to fight, so driven to raid and plunder? Much of the written history we have about Vikings comes from Christians who were their frequent victims. It is likely that some of the more brutal aspects of Viking culture have thus been overemphasized in the cultural imagination. The reality is that the Vikings were a highly organized and militarily advanced society that lived in a fairly resource-poor region of the world. The incentive to raid their resource-rich neighbors was strong, and thanks to their swift ships and remarkable fighting skills, their ability to do so was strong as well. Despite their sneak attack style, evidence shows that Viking raids often consisted of hundreds of ships. Thousands of Viking warriors would act in unison, demonstrating a very high level of coordination. They also had a clear hierarchy, with military leaders crafting strategies, and in later years, kings calling all of the shots. Even among the ranks, Vikings prided themselves on social status, and much of that status usually revolved around weaponry. All free Norse men were not only allowed to own weapons, they were required to. They could and would carry their weapons with them virtually all the time. Having multiple weapons, armor, and a helmet was as cool in Viking society as having a Rolex, a Ferrari, and a Hollywood mansion today. It showed that you were a wealthy member of the Scandinavian community. It was a community built around the conviction that what is ours must be taken, and that prosperity awaits us on the battlefield, both in life and in the afterlife. To fight like a Viking, you had to share in this hunger for destiny. Legendary fighters. Few of us would want to return to the Viking Age. It was a brutal and violent time, marred by gutsy attacks and frozen corpses. However, one can only stand in awe of what the real-life Vikings were capable of as fighters. Of all the things that made them one of the most mysterious and interesting societies in human history, their wholehearted dedication to strength and bravery is perhaps the most striking. Watched over by their own gods and goddesses, training in their own unique martial art, racing across the sea in their own distinctive ships, and raiding towns and villages with their own assortment of weapons and fighting techniques, the Vikings figured out how to fight in their own one-of-a-kind way. None could replicate it, and very few could withstand it. Fighting like a Viking today would quickly land you in jail, but taking inspiration from their stoic do-it-ourselves approach just might help us all to find new opportunities and carve our own path through this strange yet alluring world. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, have a great week. Cheers!